We're going to discuss Nazareth, so they're not all going to be this small. But today we discuss Nazareth. So we started at the birthplace of Jesus. We went through Bethlehem pretty thoroughly. We got to see the place, the area, what it looked like, what it still looked like, the dynamics of it, where they would have gone, how they would have gone down through the Jordan River Valley, the distance between the Sea of Galilee and Bethlehem, the makeup of Bethlehem. Remember, it's way up on that mountain range. And how far is it from Jerusalem? Who remembers?
7 miles.
7 miles. It's only 7 miles south of Jerusalem, Bethlehem is. But it's a major city today. Still a Christian city, even though it's being quite depopulated of its Christians as they immigrate out. The same thing for Nazareth. So, down in Judea we have Bethlehem here, Jerusalem here, and then we go up to Nazareth here. This is the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, Nazareth. So we're going to go 100 miles north right now to Nazareth. So a couple of things. Nazareth is a very special place for many, many reasons. One is the Annunciation place, correct? Right? It's where Mary gets visited by Gabriel at the well. The well is still there. You can visit the well. That's pretty neat. There's also a lot that goes on there in biblical times. We have the Annunciation, Mary leaves, Mary comes back. After they flee to Egypt, then they come back to Nazareth. Joseph starts the carpentry shop back up, and so forth. So there's one thing that we need to discuss before we go any further, though. And mostly of that is the carpentry shop. Joseph was a carpenter, so we know that. Here's Nazareth again. As you can see, there's going to be a lot of town names in here that you probably recognize. Bethsaida and Capernaum, Gennesaret, Magdala, Tiberias. A lot of these you probably have read at different places. Caesarea, you remember Jesus going there? But that's not the Caesarea of Philippi. Caesarea of Philippi is up there somewhere, but it's close. Caesarea of Philippi is up there. Caesarea is down there. So Nazareth is here. There's a big reason why Nazareth. Why Nazareth? Well, two reasons. One, you see there's a valley that comes through here, cuts through here, and then comes back up here to the Sea of Galilee. That valley, there's mountainous region here, and so this valley, as you're coming down from Rome or Greece, or sometimes you're coming up the Dead Sea Valley, the Jordan River Valley, and you cut back over here to go up to Rome or Greece, to Egypt. So this is, again, another major thoroughfare that people are traveling, and Nazareth just happens to be what we kind of call like a gas station stop along the old travel routes that was the ancient world. So it would have been, you would have had probably come up here, you would have gotten some fish, and you would have gotten everything ready, and then you'd have made your way over if you're going up to Greece or going over to Rome, or even at this time, even early parts of the Parisian lore start. Or if you're coming down, you're coming through this way. So Nazareth is positioned, like we said, is like a gas station area, which is really good for a carpenter because they didn't have vehicles back then, right? Like we do now. They had mostly wagons. If they were pulling something, it would be by wagon. And so you can understand where a carpenter would get most of his money and trade is helping fix things. A side of something, a wheel of something, something's broken. That's Joseph's business. Joseph makes his money doing that. There's one carpentry shop in that era, that time frame in Nazareth. We know that because as we've dug down and done archaeological digs, we found one carpentry shop. There's no other carpentry shops. It would have been too small of a town to kind of have more than one carpenter. And there would have been other carpenters near Tiberias, Capernaum, things of that sort. So that's Nazareth. Cana, as you can see, is right up here. That's going to kind of come next, but Cana is the place of the first miracle, the wedding, things of that sort. So this is where we're going to focus on today. As you can see, we have a big swathing valley that comes up and over into the Sea of Galilee, And then we go from mountainous region back to mountainous region, and the valley in between is very important. So this is kind of a rough idea of what Nazareth would have looked like, Second Temple period, the time of Jesus. And this is a good idea. You see, it would have been a walled city. They were all walled cities back then. So when you're reading the Bible and you see Jesus going into a village, or you see in Acts the apostles going from place to place, always imagine them going into a walled city, a walled village, because they were all walled back then, all of them. So when we go back and we see the archaeological digs, you'll still see the walls. You see them at Capernaum. We see them even at Jericho. We see them here at Nazareth. We see the initial walls. Jerusalem is quite spectacular because the walls are still there. They're massive and they're impressive. But these were all walled cities. So there would have been a walled city. Inside the walled city would have started out as 2 or 3 families. They would have built a structure for themselves. Then they would have built a wall for some security and safety. And then it would grow. As their little civilization grows, so grows Nazareth. So this is a depiction of the well outside of the city. The well is the well of Annunciation. This is what the city looks like today. Quite a bit different. Nazareth is a major city. It's a major city when you have a Ford dealership. And it's a Ford dealership. It's a major city. This right here is the Church of the Annunciation. You'll see a lot of these are monasteries. All of these with the roofs. There's different orders that are in these different buildings, but this specifically is the Church of the Annunciation.
Is that where the well is?
It's not where the well is, actually. No, you would think it's where the well is, but actually something else is there, and we'll look at that in just a second. The well is actually right over here, and it's in a kind of inconspicuous area. It was found sometime later. So here we see the church, the main church. If you look kind of over here, you'll see another smaller church. That's St. Joseph's Church, and we'll look a little bit at that here in a minute as well. But St. Joseph's Church. This is another aerial view of Nazareth. It's a pretty major city. This is the Church of the Annunciation, another view of it from the outside, kind of peering towards it. It's a beautiful church, a beautiful structure. What you see here is an archaeological dig, and it's a pathway that leads right in here. On the first floor, the ground floor, the Church of the Annunciation, is Jesus' childhood home, where Jesus was born and raised. Well, not where he's born. He was born in Bethlehem. The Texans always have to say born and raised. Not born and raised, just raised. He's raised here. Jesus' childhood home is here. And what you see here is an archaeological dig. Actually, this is under here is where his childhood home was. And then this was actually a pathway or a working way to Joseph's shop. You'll see this structure right here, which is St. Joseph's Church, which is the archaeological dig that church is built on. The archaeological dig of what? Can anybody guess?
Joseph's shop.
Joseph's shop, that's right. Joseph's carpentry shop is built on top of that. And it's really quite neat to see. You'll see some of it tonight. This is inside the Church of the Annunciation. As you peer in, this is kind of from midway up, the Church of the Annunciation. You'll see a couple of things. Number one, right off the bat, you see the Jerusalem cross. Right, the Jerusalem cross is a cross with 4 crosses in it. Most people think that's a Crusader's cross, which was used by the Crusaders to bring them all together, right? One of the kings said, if we all come under this cross and we use it, but that's the cross actually is much older than that. The Jerusalem cross originated with the piercings of Christ around the cross that he's crucified on, and what the church uses that for, and what the apostolic church used this symbol for, is that it is displayed places where Jesus was. So in Nazareth, you'll see on the Church of Annunciation, the Jerusalem cross. You'll see the Jerusalem cross in Bethlehem. You'll see it obviously in Jerusalem, in Capernaum, Caesarea Philippi, You will not see it in doubts. If you do, they're not properly displayed. This is another picture, kind of a little bit further back, so I took the first picture kind of up here. This is another picture kind of looking down a bit, and you'll see a hole in the floor of the church. Underneath, what you can see down there, if you peer over, is the archaeological dig of Jesus' childhood home. It's really beautiful, and we're going to talk about some of these in a minute, but you'll see these mosaics along the walls. I spoke about that a little bit last week. Those mosaics, the church asked for each country to send them a mosaic, to send them a mosaic of what they thought Mary looked like. And you'll see some, I think, some really beautiful concepts of what Mary looks like. This is underneath now, so I try to drop down. You'll see this is the same hole, so we stay oriented. That's the hole peering down, and what you see here is Jesus' childhood home. How do we know that? Right? This is something that people argue a lot, specifically here in the United States, for whatever reason. For whatever reason, here in America, we have to be right so much that we will throw away true archaeological science and tradition in order to say we're right and they're wrong. Well, we know that for a couple of reasons. Number one, Scripture tells us that Joseph was a carpenter, right? And so we found a carpentry shop and an archaeological dig. Well, actually, it had been preserved for 1700 years before that. But archaeologists in present day, the last 200 years, have done work to discover that it is Second Temple period. But really, about 200 years after Christ, the church builds a church here. So we say, so what do the skeptics say? The skeptics always say, well, that's 200 years. You have 200 years. We don't know what it is. Well, in 200 years, they didn't create a fake carpentry shop with a house downhill from it, and so they could scam people. That's not what they did, number one. Number two, people think, 200 years, right? You have a 200-year gap, but we can easily go and see a cherry tree, what is that? An what do they call it? Orchard. We can see the orchard cherry trees where George Washington was, right? Yeah. But that's longer ago, but no one doubts that at all, right? We can go see Abraham Lincoln's cabin. No one doubts that, right? However, this was in the family. This would have been in Joseph, Mary's family. When they died, they would have been passed on to one of the children. One of the children would have raised their kids, seemingly would have raised their kids. They didn't forget who Jesus was. And so you're going to tell me that in a span of a few generations before the church takes the property and builds a church on it, that they just forgot completely where Jesus was. That's a debate for someone who is saying that Jesus never existed, right? And that's a false debate. We know for certainty that Jesus existed. We can debate whether or not Jesus is our Lord and Savior, but to say he doesn't exist is ludicrous. We have writings outside of the Scriptures, from Roman writings to other writings. We know with certainty that Jesus did exist, that Jesus was put to death, and so on. So, if we know he's a real person, we know his family lived here, we know this is the only carpentry shop in Nazareth, it dates to the right time, we can pretty much clearly say this is where Jesus was raised. But there are a lot of people, like I said, that get so angry about that for whatever reason. Why not just be happy that we can see some of this stuff? It's pretty beautiful. So this is it. You see kind of the major outline of it. Coming out, there's a stairway that comes out here that goes up that path, which would take you right to the carpentry shop. Now these are pillars that were actually added by the Byzantines about 250 years after Jesus. They add these columns and they add this. This is the part of the original church that was built on the site of Jesus' childhood home. It's really quite neat to go and to peer in and think about Jesus being there. This is a mass being held inside there. They hold 2 masses in there every day. It's really quite beautiful. And if you're there, you can take part in the mass the Mass taking part inside the home of Jesus. This is a better, just kind of picture with the gate open. So the gate's open here. We can see a couple of things. Some of the original masonry up here. I think Victor was a part of putting that in.
Yeah.
Weren't you?
That was on Monday morning.
Yeah. I think so. That's another reason we know, because they didn't pay all of the bill. He still says that Joseph stiffed it. No. This is some of the original masonry. They would have always had these domes for a couple of different reasons, but those domes in that area, for the most part, was to keep the hot air up, the cool air down. So you'll always see these domes in the main place where they occupied. And then this is the stairwell that goes out and up to the carpentry shop. Out and up to the carpentry shop. So that's Jesus' childhood home. There's another picture of it. You can see some of the original church pillars. It's a really moving, beautiful place. It's a pretty neat place just to be in for a minute. I think that Jesus was there as a young child. Up that pathway, we come to this church. This is the St. Joseph's Church. You'll see kind of the Holy Family up here, and then actually just below the altar here is the archaeological site. It's not as well produced. It's really kind of underneath. You have to go down these side stairs to get there. And so this is the main church here, and then we'll go down underneath. This is where you have to go. You walk down these stairs through this little fence gate, through the gates, and then you can't see it very clearly, but I wish you would be able to see it better. That's actually a Jerusalem cross there, depicting that Jesus was here. And this is the site of Joseph's carpentry shop. You see some stairs kind of up here. This is a beautiful mosaic done by the Byzantine Empire. It's very, very old. We see Joseph here, and we see Mary, and we see Jesus kind of motioning over to Mary. This is a really neat depiction for me. I like this depiction a lot. I think it kind of looks like almost as if it's one of the many times Jesus comes back to Nazareth, almost maybe. And Mary's trying to wait on him, or trying to feed him. He doesn't want it, and Joseph's kind of just back there working, just doing what dads do. Am I right, guys? Just working, not getting any credit. I always laugh because even in the chapel of St. Joseph, when you go in and go out, there's a beautiful portrait of who? Mary. You can't, dads, you can't win. It's okay. This is back in the Church of the Annunciation. What's that?
Go back to the other picture.
Go back to the other picture.
So people walk around and all that.
No, you cannot walk on that.
Wondering how that rock stays so wide.
Yeah, you cannot walk on this part here. There's a partition where you can really. It's just a little rail that's about waist high. So there's really nothing stopping you other than you really shouldn't. But no, you can't go back there.
Okay.
There is a well kind of off to the left where people throw money, but yes.
Why did they build it underground? For the temperature, climate?
Well, so this wasn't built underground at the time. At the time, this was a structure. And they built the church on top of the structure to protect it. So this has just been a masonry building that would have been built kind of in domes for the heat, and so they could have smoke exhaust. But it wouldn't have been underground at the time. It would have been a structure to walk into, but they built the church on top of it to preserve it.
Well, then Victor didn't build that.
Why is that?
Because it wouldn't be standing today.
That's not good, Victor. I don't appreciate it.
Well, I mean, that's hard to
I don't like
believe
people
that
making fun of
it
it.
was built that strong back then without the tools we have today.
It's really incredible. You know, on our trips, typically we'll go to London first. And there's a reason for that. When you fly over, you fly to London. You'll spend a day in London, 12 hours in London. You have a 12-hour layover, and I kind of give you an itinerary to go around the city. And then you get back on the plane, and the idea is that you fly over, you make yourself stay awake, and then you sleep on the plane to Jerusalem. And when you get there, or to Tel Aviv, then you'll be good. But everyone gets to London and they see structures that are 800 years old, right? 900 years old. They're blown away. And the first thing they want to tell me about when they see me in the airport in Tel Aviv is, I just saw something that's 1,000 years old. It was Roman. And I say, we're going to go to Jericho. It's 10,000 years old. It's the oldest city in the world. We stay in a house that's 1,300 years old. Jerusalem is, some of the walls are 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old. It's amazing to see what they were able to do. And if you were with us last year we did Exodus, right, during Lent? And we saw the master builders that the Jews were, the Hebrew people were. Master builders, how amazing their building structures were. Back to the Church of the Annunciation. The Church of the Annunciation, I told you they have these beautiful artworks all over. I think it's really quite a neat thing. Here's why. For whatever reason, it's in vogue now. We have to be politically correct, and I'm not, everything has to be very politically correct. But for years and years and years, no one had an issue with people thinking that Jesus or Mary or whoever looked like you, right? Because what does the Bible say? We're made in whose image? God's image. And so when we're talking to our children, we should want them to think that Jesus and Mary and Joseph look like them. We're made in God's image. For whatever reason, in the last 6 to 7 years, it's become this big deal, right? Like, Jesus was actually this, well, he was actually that. It really doesn't matter what Jesus was. People say, well, he would have looked Middle Eastern. He would not have looked Middle Eastern. If people say that, please tell them to stop. The Turks don't come over for another 600 years to 800 years. He would have looked Phoenician, Galilean, he would have looked Greek, so he would have had darker skin. But the Phoenician people of that era specifically were known to have dark skin and what? Blue eyes. So I don't think he was probably blonde, but to see a picture of Jesus with dark skin and blue eyes is not too far off. But it doesn't matter what Jesus looked like. That's really, I think, the important thing. I think everyone should be able to look at Jesus and Mary and see in their mind's eye someone that looks like them. I think that's a great thing. It doesn't matter. It's one of my big pet peeves when people are like, we need to talk about what Jesus looked like. Why? You don't even pray to him daily. What do you care what he looks like? You don't even talk to him. What do you care what he looks like? But these are really beautiful, and these happened kind of before this new explosion has come out of this kind of politically correct world. And I think it's really beautiful because every country sent back these mosaics, and it's beautiful. It's kind of what Mary, Joseph, and Jesus kind of would have looked like in their country. So you can see some of these: Romania, Esperantos, really quite beautiful. You see kind of the Latin on this side, more of the Romanian Black Forest on that side. This is my favorite one, is France. I just think it's beautiful. It's very French. I like seeing Mary kind of with a crown on her head. That's neat, you know, and little baby Jesus with the holy halo around him. Even though he kind of looks like a miniature full-grown man. Yeah. But it's neat. I like the Holy Spirit coming down. I thought they, for whatever reason, it's always my favorite one. I like this one a lot. This was done by the people in Nazareth. And so the people in Nazareth typically that are Christians are Palestinian Christians, so they are Middle Eastern. The Palestinian Christians have been there for over 1,000 years. So a very, very long time. Some of the oldest Christians in the world. And the Palestinian Christians there depicted Mary like this. Looks a lot like what we have on our Christmas pageants, right? And so there's so much debate here in the United States over things that no one else in the world really debates about. And I don't fully understand why, other than we just like to argue. We just really like to argue. This is Japan. I think it's really quite beautiful. With the flowers and the kind of the gold built in there. Mary and Jesus of an Asian descent, and I don't think there's anything wrong with a little Japanese boy seeing.
So how long ago were all these mosaics?
So these were done in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, okay.
50s and 60s. Yeah, these are not old.
In the last 100 years?
Yeah, these are
Oh,
not
okay.
old.
Okay.
60s into some of the 70s. These are not old whatsoever. But I just think that's really neat. That's a beautiful depiction there. Everyone always asks me, what does America's look like? Unfortunately, that's it. What is wrong with us?
That's ours.
Why do we have to do this?
That's ugly.
It's not Canada though. I don't have Canada. Canada's bad. Who's been there? Well, you remember Canada? Looks like a sandstorm. It's terrible. Shame on you, Canada. Shame on you. They don't want to offend people so bad, it just looks like lumps of sand. That's America's though. I think it's somehow, I don't know.
Can't even tell what
I
it
don't
is.
know. I don't know. Do better, America. Okay, so this is Precipice. We're still in Nazareth. We've left Nazareth. A couple of things happen here at Precipice, but the major thing that you'll remember that happens at Precipice is the first time Jesus comes back during his ministry, right? He comes back, he's a rabbi, he comes into the temple, he starts to speak with authority, and the people start saying, hey, aren't you Jesus? Aren't you Mary's child? Who gives you the ability to speak with this authority? How can you do that? And he says the very famous things about no prophet is welcomed in his hometown for many reasons, right? And the people get so angry with him. What do? Do you remember? What do? They go to throw him off a cliff. That is tough, Nazareth. I mean, that is tough. That is really, really tough. So Mary at some point put the little bumper sticker on her car that said, "My child is a Messiah." Everyone got very upset about that. The other mothers were not happy, so they were going to throw him off a cliff. This is Precipice. This is the cliff that they were going to throw him off of. This is a very sharp cliff. I say this every time. Lola snapped at me. I heard her mother voice when she was there. She said I was too close to the edge of the cliff. Lola said, "Get back over here." So we're looking down in that valley we talked about, and we'll see another picture in a second. But we're looking down in that valley. You see this swathing valley, and this valley goes from over here, which is the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to the Sea of Galilee and to the Jordan River Valley. And they would have taken that valley as they're doing their transportation, as they're going from place to place, as we have trade, as we have any kind of travel going from these major cities, Egypt and Rome and Greece, down to the Indochine, up to where kind of present-day India is, up into the Baltic regions. All of that stuff is happening here. The Black Sea regions. All that is coming through this valley. All that's coming through this valley. This valley is also, it's a cloudy day here. You can kind of see some of the mountain range on the other side. But that valley, and we'll talk about this next week more, is also the reason why there's storms that come up into the Sea of Galilee so quickly and so frequently, and just this raging storm will appear out of nowhere. The wind comes pushing up into the Mediterranean Sea. It has nowhere to go, so it whistles through this valley. It gets caught in that bowl, and it just swirls until it comes out. We'll talk about that next week as we get to the Sea of Galilee. This is another picture looking down off of Precipice. It is very steep. Lola was not happy. A very steep drop. And so when they go to throw Jesus off of Precipice or off the cliff, what happens? Who knows? Jesus passes through their midst. He passes through their midst. So Jesus, it's not his time. This is not the time for him to do that. And so he passes through their midst. Another nice picture. This is another great picture, though. The very first thing I hear when people get there is, I just saw something 800 to 1,000 years old in London. The next thing I hear when we're driving from the airport is, I can't believe it's so green. I can't believe there's such trees. I can't believe most of Israel, with the exception when we go into the Wadi in the desert that goes out to the Jordan, is green. It's lush. It's a mountain range. And so when you're reading through the Bible and it talks about these cedar trees, and it talks about this lush vegetation, and you hear Jesus using words about these lush, like farming right? And wheat and grapes, and that's what the region looks like. And you can see it here. It's a very lush region. It gets a lot of rainfall off the Mediterranean there up in the mountains, because it gets all the rainfall as it bumps in the mountains, it falls, and it doesn't go into the desert. Hence the desert. It's a very lush area, and it's temporal. It's like we said last week, it's about the exact same temperature as it is here, year round. Whatever it is here, it is there. So in the summer it's very hot, in the winter it can be pretty cool, and so forth. These are two pictures off of that same area up on Precipice. These are two pictures. It's the same hill or mountain. That is Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is also what? Anyone? The Mount of Transfiguration. The Mount of Transfiguration. This is the Mount of Transfiguration. The only thing on top of the Mount of Transfiguration is a small chapel. It's really beautiful, but you have to hike to get up there. And it's not easy to get there. It's maintained by some of the monks there at the Basilica of the Annunciation. But it's really quite beautiful. It's a bit of ways out, but you can see it's just outside of Nazareth. And so, again, hopefully we're going to start painting a picture as we go from here to the Sea of Galilee and Capernaum, down the sea, the Jordan River Valley, into Jericho, up into Jerusalem. We're going to see Jerusalem. We're going to start painting these pictures so that when you're reading the scriptures and Jesus leaves Caesarea Philippi, right, and he comes down from Caesarea Philippi into Nazareth, and he tells the disciples that for the first time that he's going to die. Not only that he's going to die, but he's going to be crucified, and they're just beside themselves. And he says, pick up your cross and carry me. Then he goes into Nazareth, right, and that he leaves Nazareth and does what? The Mount of Transfiguration. And so when you're reading the scriptures next time, hopefully as you're reading that, you can see as it kind of flows, these aren't like chop, 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 chop. He leaves Nazareth, he goes out of Nazareth, and he goes up to Mount Tabor, he brings the three, and that is where the Transfiguration happens. So it's just outside of Nazareth. So as the scripture talks about them leaving Nazareth, and the next thing you see is Mount Tabor, you'll see, oh, okay, it makes sense. Remember, as you're reading through the scriptures, they don't have all of the narrative editing because they could only put as much in as the codex would allow. So they're trying to use all their space as best as possible. So they're not going to say, Jesus left Nazareth and then he went, a few miles out to the east, and then there was a hill there. They're not going to do that. They're going to say they left Nazareth, then they're going to start telling you about the Mount of Transfiguration, right? About Mount Tabor. So we can start to see this flow. He was going from Nazareth to Capernaum, and he goes to Mount Tabor. This is another view, kind of a panoramic view of the area. This is that valley that we talked about. You see Mount Tabor here off in the distance. The mountains kind of kick back up, and you can see this kind of panoramic view there off of Precipice, kind of dives down, and you'll see kind of that valley that's cutting across from our right to our left. Our right to our left. And I do want to go back to a map. I want to go back to this map right here. So again, this is that valley we talked about. It's cutting through, comes up here. And this is the whole idea. Remember we talked about right here, and we're going to go over this more in a couple of weeks, but right here is the baptismal site. And this is also the area that the Hebrews crossed into the promised land, right? So they come and they cross into the promised land, cross into the promised land. Baptismal sites here, we know that for a couple of different reasons. Number one, it's the very first place in which there's a bit of a crossable area, because right in here it's too marshy, it's too mucky, it's too muddy, so it starts to solid up and there's a place to cross. Number two, we know that because for the Jews, what did they do as soon as they cross? They made a monument to say this is where it was, and so it was a very special place to them. They didn't just leave; they stayed there for many years. And when John the Baptist comes out, right, he goes to a place in which all of these people are going to be coming to him, because right here is where the cross section happens. These people are coming down through here, out here, or you're coming from Egypt and you're going up here, but this is the cross section right here at the baptismal place, is the cross section, the intersection of the ancient world, right? And there's a couple of other reasons why we know that. Number one, when he leaves the baptismal site, he walks out into where? Where does he go? Into Jericho. And what happens to be right here is Jericho. It's the oldest city in the world. It hasn't moved. And so we know exactly where it is. We know exactly where it is. And we'll get to that a little bit later. The baptismal site, really beautiful. I'll show some pictures here in a couple weeks. The cool thing about the baptismal site, you'll see this in pictures. I've said this before. But the baptismal site there in the Jordan River is the only place in Israel that I've seen, and I've asked many people in Mo, and this is the only place they've seen that white doves just live. They live there at the baptismal place, which is really quite amazing. When you drive in, there'll just be white doves. It's really quite amazing. So this is the cross section. Why does John the Baptist go there? To prepare the way, to cry out, to prepare the road, right? Because that's literally the cross intersection of the ancient world. So when John the Baptist is right here and he's preaching this gospel of Christ coming, the Messiah coming, he's literally in the one place that word is going to get to everyone in the world. Something's about to happen. Something is about to happen. That's why Herod knows. That's why all these people know. That's why the ancient world was abuzz. Something's going on. Herod starts killing children. It's a big deal, right? We go back to Bethlehem and remember the cave we talked about Jesus being born in, and the Gabriel sending the shepherds up the valley to the mouth of the cave, to the front of the cave to kind of protect it. All of these things start to come together. And now as we see these things and we start reading through the scriptures, hopefully it'll make more sense. It's not just a fantasy story. They're giving you an eyewitness account of some of these things as they're going on, as they take place. So we're going to leave Nazareth with Jesus, and we're going to come down, around, and up, and we're going to go to Capernaum next. So we're going to talk about all of the Sea of Galilee, but mostly Capernaum, because Capernaum is the city of Jesus. The city of Jesus. Jesus spends most of his time in the New Testament in Capernaum. We'll see the synagogue next week, where 70 or more % of all the red letters you see in your Bible were spoken in that synagogue. It's a very important place in Christendom, in our own lives, and our understanding and our faith. And so we're going to spend some time there in Capernaum. Magdala is not as well known for a couple of reasons, but Jesus of Nazareth, right? Mary of Nazareth, we hear those things. Who do you think comes from Magdala? Can anybody tell me? Not somebody who went. Mary. Mary. We say Magdalene now as it's kind of gone through an Irish accent, but it's of Magdala. But that's where Mary Magdalene's from, right? Perfect, right there. Right between these two right here, it hasn't been in existence for many years, but we know where it was, is Nirvana. Is Nirvana, the town Nirvana. Who remembers from our Sunday school classes who's from Nirvana? Timothy. Timothy's from Nirvana, and Timothy goes where after the resurrection? Where does Timothy, not Timothy, Thomas. Doubting Thomas. Thomas, sorry, is Thomas. Yeah, Thomas, I'm sorry, I was convinced. You had me convinced, you answered it so well. No, it's Thomas. But Thomas, doubting Thomas, at first he's doubting, then he touches Jesus, and he's so invigorated, he's so filled with this gusto and this faith that he goes to where in his faith mission to mission. He goes to India, right? And India is where Thomas goes. A couple of things. It's one of the nastiest places in the world at that time. He goes to India. He meets these Hindu people. Some of them become Christians. We have a very large Christian influence now. Thomas has many statues in India still to this very day. So there's a lot of Christian influence. But the Hindus, right? The Hindus, some of them believe it. Some of them don't believe it all the way. They create Buddhism. And Buddhism talks about what? Finding what? Nirvana. Because they want to find where Thomas came from. Because Thomas was so filled with peace. And so a lot of this stuff comes from early apostolic Christianity that's brought over. And so when you hear stuff about the very old Catholic Church or Apostolic Church talk about meditative prayer, and they're like, people will say, well, that's an Eastern thing. Well, the East got it from us. We just don't do it. We forgot about it, right? Nirvana, they want to find nirvana. They want to find the peace that Thomas had. Why did Thomas have that peace? Because he knew that Jesus died and resurrected. He saw it. He felt the holes. Of all people, Thomas, do whatever you want with me, right? He knew that he was going to be fine. And so they wanted to find that nirvana. So that's where that is. So we're going to spend some more time in here. We're going to look at many pictures and we'll walk through it. Are there any questions right now, or you want to go back and discuss anything about Nazareth? Nazareth. Yes, sir.
Well, the way you described Jesus' home in Nazareth, seems like Joseph was a fairly influential person.
Well, he would have been a big deal, not kind of the biggest deal, but a carpenter in that time frame is not a lacking trade. That's a very high trade. A carpenter is a big deal, and to have a carpenter in your town is a big deal. He would have had a shop. So carpentry is one of the things that would have helped the whole town, because why? For the main reason of travelers would have stopped there and said, hey, before we keep in this little valley, in this mountainous region, rocky region, let's get some stuff shored up. Let's stay here a couple nights. So we know that this happened, but one of the major trades going on, Cana traded a lot of wine with them, which they still have wine today, which is kind of a neat thing. They would have gotten fish from the Sea of Galilee. So Nazareth becomes kind of this, like we said, a gas stop almost for the ancient travelers. They get there, get the wagons worked on a little bit, get this stuff worked on a little bit, we'll stop. So it would have been something that's very helpful for the community, right? They want a carpenter there. Carpenter is a big deal. His family, Joseph's family, was carpenters. Jesus was trained as a carpenter. The other children were trained as carpenters. That's a family trade. It would have been his family trade. It would not. It's not a. It wouldn't have been a rich person's trade, but it wouldn't have been. You wouldn't have been desolate either. You would not have been desolate either. Yes, sir.
Most of the tools were wood tools, right? I mean, metal wasn't really.
It was difficult to find, but now remember we have come through the Bronze Age really at this point, and so we do have some. That's how they're building the second temple, is by using metals for some of the first time. So there is some metal, and it's really starting to be introduced, but for the most part it is wood. A lot of it, and there is, you can see, well, at Petra in Jordan, they have a really neat woodworking display where they'll show you how they cut slices of this wood and how they put it in water, and after so many days of water, how they can bend it, and then what they have to do to dry it out quickly so that it'll remain, and all these different stuff that they do. And I'm by no means a Second Temple period era carpenter, but a lot of it was wood. A lot of it was kind of jigsawing and putting pins in and banging them in, and things of that sort. Yeah, dowel work. But yes, a lot of it was that. I've been in a lot of fire. There have been a lot of. That's why there's. Again, I'm not an expert on carpentry of that section, but there's a giant well. There's a big water surplus area in his workshop, and there's a very hot working chimney in his workshop at the same time. And he's taking wood and he's making it soft, and then he's bending it to where it needs to go, and then he's drying it out very quickly. And again, I'm not an expert, but yes, sir.
Pastor, what's the name of that valley? I've been trying to read that.
The Kishon, this is the Kishon River, but it's the Kishon Valley.
Where it says valley, what is it?
Oh, the Jezreel Valley. The Jezreel Valley is it'd be a very Israeli way to say it. We would say the Kishon Valley, because that's kind of what we see in the Greek New Testament, but it is the Jezreel Valley. And we have any other questions? Yes, sir.
How far could they travel in miles in a day?
So it obviously depends on what they have, but typically 10 to 15 miles a day if they were traveling for trading purposes. If they're traveling individual, just maybe them and a donkey or just them going, they can make a little bit more time. But these, for most part, the people that are traveling these are trading. They're taking goods from their village and going and getting goods from another village, or they're going long distance to these major cities and bringing back things that they know they can use. Gold starts to be used in Rome, coins are being used, and so they want to take their goods to places where they can get some of these coins. That's really becoming quite a big deal. As we see in the New Testament, we're right in between kind of the coin age and where we're still bringing sacrifices to the temple. Because when we get to the temple, some people are still bringing their animals. Some people are doing what? They're paying for them when they get there. So we're starting to see that this monetary value really coming in, which really frustrates Jesus quite a bit. But that's another story. Good question. Yes?
Did the carpenters do stonework too, or was that a completely different profession?
I believe masonry was a different profession entirely. I believe. But I'm not an expert on that part. But I do believe masonry was a different thing. I know that as you go to Jerusalem, underneath Jerusalem, you'll see these giant caves, Solomon's caves, where they start to kind of take stone out that they can cut, and the masons have their own kind of identity. The masons do. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes, Judith.
Was there anything exciting about Nazareth in the Old Testament?
No,
So was it a relatively new town?
it is. Yeah, Nazareth in the time of Jesus is it's a relatively small town. As a matter of fact, it's well believed that Cana is the larger of the two cities at that time. Cana is the larger of the two cities, which is up here, and most likely people initially before, remember, as we start to get into metal, we start to see more things we can travel with more. We're building larger things to be able to pull stuff with. And so initially people are just kind of coming across this and making their way over. But as they start having kind of bigger wagons, more wagons, this starts to be more of the route all the way through the valley where it's easier. And so Nazareth really takes a hold. But no, Nazareth is a relatively new city in the time of Jesus. It's not a large city whatsoever. It grows primarily historically because the Byzantines make it a holy site. And when they make it a holy site, people are flocked there, and it grows from that. Other than that, there's really no reason for it to be a major city, which it is today. Any other questions? Yes.
How is the Sea of Galilee filled up with water? Is it from north of there, or is it just the rain?
That's a good question, and we'll talk about that next week in depth. But it's from this little riverway. There's the larger mountain range is to the north, there in Lebanon, and that mountain range is what feeds the Sea of Galilee. That's what feeds it. That and rainwater runoff. But we will talk more in depth about that. It's a very good question. Any other questions?
Well, didn't they have a lot of storms around the Sea of Galilee?
There's a lot of storms, and we're going to get into that too in depth next week. A lot of storms. And we see that in the New Testament, quite often. Next time you're reading it, and you're reading about some of these storms flash up, you'll understand that's something that does happen to this day. It happens in that area, because sometimes people can read and say, oh, that's a little hokey, that just a storm came out of nowhere. No, these happen today for a very obvious reason, geographical obvious reason. Any other questions on Nazareth?
So you said the storms come from the valley, not the Jezreel Valley. What valley did they come from?
They come from this valley, yes. Off of here, they're funneled down and they come up. Boom.
Oh, okay.
They come up here. You can see it a little bit better here. This is the valley that funnels the storms up, and the wind will either come this way or this way. And then there's only one way. You'll see this more in depth next week, but there's only one way for the weather once it comes in here to get out, and that's either by swirling and coming out the top, or through another little valley that goes out that way. But even then, it has to go higher in altitude And so the wind starts swirling as more pressure builds up and builds up. Any other questions? Okay. Well, Nazareth, like we said, is a very important place. And I think it's important that we know to strengthen our own faith. Let me go to that we know for our own faith that, this is not a fairy tale. The thing that we have here in our faith is a scientifically documented, proven thing of where Jesus was, where he lived. The stories that we know of that are in Scripture are backed by archaeology to this very day, and through people keeping those sites holy for many years from that point on. But so again, for people who attribute or think that this stuff is not there, it is there. We can see the place where Jesus was born. We now this week we're seeing the place where Jesus was raised. Next week we're going to see St. Peter's house. St. Peter's house, the second built church in the world over St. Peter's house. St. Peter's house is where Jesus spends a lot of time. And the synagogue there, where Jesus does most of his teachings, they're still there. We can see them, you can touch them, you can feel them. And so it's very important. For our faith, for the defense of our faith, not even for outside people, but for us. These are real things. These are real tangible places that you can see and touch and smell and feel. This is not just a story in a book. That's what, the enemy wants you to think, that these are just stories. These are not stories. These are eyewitness accounts. If there's no other questions, we'll be done for tonight after a word of prayer.